Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we are closing out our series on lobotomy by asking a larger and far more unsettling question. At what point does helping someone slowly become reshaping them? This week, we explored procedures, institutions, doctors, and patients. But beneath all of it was something much bigger: humanity's fear of disorder. Our fear of unpredictability. Our fear of suffering that cannot be easily solved, categorized, medicated, or controlled. Because once society begins valuing compliance and emotional stability above individuality, the line between healing and control can become dangerously thin. And maybe the most uncomfortable realization of all is that despite everything modern neuroscience has discovered, the human mind still remains one of the greatest mysteries we've ever encountered. One of the strangest things about being human is how uncomfortable we are with difficult emotions. Not just pain, unpredictability, grief that lasts too long, fear that interrupts productivity, depression that refuses to resolve neatly, emotional intensity that makes other people feel uncomfortable. Society has always struggled with emotions that it can't easily organize. That tension sits underneath this entire week, because lobotomy was never just a medical procedure. It was part of a larger cultural desire. Reduce chaos, stabilize behavior, restore predictability, eliminate disruption. And honestly, those impulses still exist today in a quieter, more socially acceptable way. Humans naturally want suffering to become manageable. That instinct isn't automatically cruel. Watching someone emotionally collapse can feel terrifying, especially when you love them, when you live with them, when you're responsible for helping them, when you don't know what to do. Hopelessness changes people. Exhaustion changes people. Caregiver burnout changes people. And throughout history, societies have repeatedly searched for ways to reduce emotional instability as quickly as possible. Sometimes compassion drives that search. Sometimes fear drives it. Usually it's a little bit of both. That's what makes the history of lobotomy so unsettling psychologically. It forces people to confront the possibility that the desire to help someone can slowly drift into the desire to make them easier to live with. Think about that. Because those are not always the same thing. A person experiencing grief, trauma, panic, psychosis, emotional volatility, severe depression, any of those things, they can profoundly affect everyone around them. Families become overwhelmed. Institutions become strained. Communities become uncomfortable. And eventually, society starts asking, how do we make this stop? And that question can lead to extraordinary compassion. But it can also lead to frightening overreach, especially once emotional discomfort itself begins getting treated like malfunction. That's part of why this topic still resonates so powerfully now. Modern society still struggles with emotional complexity constantly. People are encouraged to remain productive, to stay emotionally regulated, to function socially, to maintain composure, to recover quickly, to return to normal. And when someone cannot do those things, the discomfort spreads outward socially. Others begin feeling uncertain, helpless, impatient, concerned, sometimes even frightened. That emotional reaction is important to acknowledge honestly because it reveals something uncomfortable about our human nature. People often prefer predictability over complexity, especially in large systems. Think about it. Schools prefer predictability. Workplaces prefer predictability. Institutions prefer predictability. Governments prefer predictability. And historically, psychiatric systems often prioritized predictability as well. It's not necessarily because doctors lacked empathy, but because systems themselves naturally drift toward order. That's one of the haunting lessons left behind by the lobotomy era. The more overwhelmed a system becomes, the more seductive emotional stability starts appearing. Even if it's artificial stability, even chemically induced stability, even surgically induced stability. Did you notice? Did you notice when the ethical danger started creeping into those ideas? Because that's where it happens. Because medicine possesses extraordinary power over human suffering. But suffering itself is complicated. Not all emotional pain represents pathology. Grief after loss is painful because love mattered. Fear exists partly to protect survival. Sadness can reflect emotional depth rather than dysfunction. Anger sometimes emerges from injustice. Trauma responses often develop from unbearable experiences. Our human emotions are messy because our human existence is messy. And once society starts expecting emotions to become perfectly optimized, people themselves begin feeling increasingly mechanical. That's why emotional flattening disturbed so many families after lobotomy procedures. The distress sometimes decreased, but so did spontaneity, so did passion, so did humor, so did emotional presence. And maybe that reveals one of the most terrifying philosophical questions underneath this entire lobotomy series. How much suffering can be removed before parts of a person disappear alongside of it? Parts of a human's personhood. That whole component of autonomy should make everybody very uncomfortable. How much suffering can be removed before parts of personhood disappear alongside it? And that question doesn't have an easy answer, because nobody wants people trapped inside unbearable psychological pain. Modern mental health care matters enormously. Therapy matters enormously. Medication helps countless people live fuller, safer, and healthier lives. That truth should be stated clearly and responsibly. But history also reminds people that emotional complexity cannot always be treated like faulty machinery, requiring a simple correction. Consciousness itself remains too mysterious for that kind of certainty. That's one reason this week repeatedly returned to the idea of humility. Because the closer medicine moved toward altering the mind directly, the more careful humanity eventually realized it needed to proceed. Lobotomy exposed what happens when confidence outruns understanding. Perhaps even more importantly, it revealed how quickly societies can normalize interventions once emotional discomfort starts affecting systems broadly enough. What do you make of this? What do you make this whole week? It's a fascinating and also horrifying topic, isn't it? We always love having you along, right here on the Midnight Drive. $1,000,000 question. What actually makes a person themselves? That question sounds philosophical at first, abstract, almost impossible to clearly answer. But the history of lobotomy forced humanity into that question in an alarmingly physical way. Because once surgeons began altering the brain directly, people started witnessing something terrifying firsthand. Personalities could change. Memories could change. Emotions could change. Motivation could change. Identity itself could change. And suddenly, the comforting idea of a stable, permanent self no longer felt quite so certain. That realization unsettles people profoundly, as it should. Most people move through life with the assumption that I am me. Continuous, recognizable, whole, complete. But neuroscience, brain injury, dementia, trauma, and psychosurgery all reveal the same uncomfortable truth. The concept of self might actually be biologically fragile. That possibility creates existential fear almost immediately. Because if a personality can be physically altered, what exactly does that say about consciousness? What does it say about our memories? What does it say about our individuality? What does it say about the idea of soul? Those questions sit quietly underneath almost every unsettling reaction that people have had to this topic all week. Not just the fear of the procedure itself, fear of what the procedure revealed. And honestly, many people encounter smaller versions of that fear long before ever learning about the idea of lobotomy. Watching dementia unfold can feel emotionally devastating for exactly this reason. A loved one begins forgetting names, then faces, then memories, then emotional continuity. Sometimes personality changes emerge. Sometimes familiar warmth disappears. And sometimes confusion replaces recognition. And the grief becomes uniquely painful because the body remains physically present while pieces of identity seem increasingly unreachable. That experience leaves lasting emotional scars on families because it forces people into a horrifying realization. The human self is not as fixed as we emotionally want it to be. Brain trauma reveals similar fears. A concussion can affect mood. An injury can affect impulse control. A tumor can alter personality. Neurological disease can reshape behavior completely. Even modern neuroscience still cannot fully explain why consciousness emerges the way that it does. The brain remains one of the most mysterious structures humanity has ever studied, which makes the confidence surrounding early psychosurgery feel even more disturbing in retrospect, because humanity began physically intervening in personality before truly understanding what personality even was. What an astonishing thing to consider, isn't it? Maybe that's why lobotomy history still feels so heavy now, even heavier than other types of medical mistakes. It crosses into existential territory, Not simply, can medicine heal the body? But rather, what parts of a person can be changed before they stop feeling like themselves? And that question doesn't really have a clear answer. And maybe it never will, because identity itself appears to emerge from an incredibly delicate interaction between biology and memory and emotion and perception and experience and relations and environment. Damage or alter one part of that system, and unexpected changes can ripple outward. That's part of what made emotional flattening after lobotomy feel so tragic to so many families. Loved ones often described patients as distant, emotionally dulled, less expressive, less spontaneous, disconnected from former passions. The suffering sometimes looked reduced externally, but so did emotional richness. That creates one of the most unsettling ethical questions in psychiatric history. If pain disappears because emotional depth disappears too, was healing actually achieved? Or was something essential simply removed? That question still resonates because people instinctively understand that emotion itself gives texture to life. Joy matters because attachment matters. Grief matters because love matters. Fear matters because vulnerability matters. Even emotional struggle can carry meaning. Art emerges from emotional intensity sometimes. Connection emerges from emotional openness. Resilience emerges from hardship. Human existence becomes strangely hollow without emotional depth. That doesn't mean suffering should be romanticized. Severe mental illness is real. Trauma is real. Depression is real. Psychosis is real. Psychological pain can become unbearable and life-threatening. Compassionate treatment matters enormously. But the history of lobotomy revealed something medicine now approaches far more cautiously. Altering suffering is not mechanically simple because suffering itself is often intertwined with identity. And that realization helped modern neuroscience and psychiatry evolve more carefully. The failures of early psychosurgery forced medicine into greater humility surrounding consent, ethics, patient autonomy, neurological complexity, and long-term outcomes. Because once enough patients emerged permanently altered, society could no longer ignore how dangerous certainty becomes when dealing with consciousness itself. And honestly, maybe that humility is one of the most important lessons this entire history leaves behind. The human mind is not a machine with clearly labeled components. Emotion cannot always be separated cleanly from personality. Memory cannot always be separated cleanly from identity. Consciousness cannot always be reduced into neat mechanical explanations. Even modern neuroscience still stands at the edge of enormous mystery. That should inspire wonder. But it should also inspire caution. Because whenever humanity becomes overly confident in areas involving the self itself, people risk becoming experiments before the science truly understands the consequences. That's why this history still lingers emotionally. It's not because society fears old psychiatric procedures specifically, but because lobotomy forced people to confront something permanently unsettling: the line between who you are and the physical structure of your brain. That line may be far thinner than humans ever wanted to believe. What do you make of all this? Let us know in the comments below wherever you might be listening tonight. We always love having you along for the ride right here on the Midnight Drive. One of the most important things to understand about the history of lobotomy is that modern psychiatry did not stay there. Again, one of the most important things to understand about the history of lobotomy is that modern psychiatry did not stay there. That distinction is so important because conversations about historical medical failures can sometimes drift into cynicism very quickly. But the real lesson of this history is not science is dangerous. No, the lesson is science requires humility. And honestly, modern mental health care evolved partly because earlier generations were forced to confront the consequences of getting things so terribly wrong. Lobotomy became one of the clearest warnings in modern medical history about what can happen when confidence outruns understanding. That warning changed psychiatry permanently. Patient rights evolved, consent standards evolved, neurological research evolved, ethical oversight evolved, trauma studies evolved. And medicine slowly became far more cautious about interventions involving personality, memory, emotion, and cognition. That progress matters. Because unlike the era that we explored earlier this week, modern psychiatry operates with vastly more scientific understanding than the systems that created psychosurgery. It's not a perfect understanding, but a significantly deeper understanding. Researchers now recognize trauma reshapes behavior, environment affects mental health, emotional regulation is neurologically complex, medications impact people differently, mental illness exists on spectrums, identity and cognition are extraordinarily intricate. That complexity encouraged psychiatry to move away from simplistic, one procedure solves everything thinking. And maybe that's one of the most helpful outcomes to emerge from such a disturbing chapter of history. Medicine became more careful, partly because medicine learned respect for how fragile and complicated the human mind actually is. The story of lobotomy should not create fear of mental health care. It should create appreciation for why modern ethics matter so much. Because ethical medicine is not built merely from scientific capability. It's built from restraint, oversight, transparency, consent, accountability, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to admit uncertainty honestly. One of the recurring problems through this entire week was institutional certainty. Doctors who believed they understood more than they actually did. Institutions believed order equaled wellness. Systems prioritized manageability before fully understanding emotional cost. And patients often carried the consequences permanently. Modern psychiatry still faces difficult questions constantly. Medication decisions can be complicated. Therapy outcomes vary. Neurological disorders remain difficult to treat. Severe mental illness can still devastate lives and families. But modern mental health care generally approaches those realities with far greater humility than the era that embraced lobotomy, at least ideally. That humility matters because there is no emotionally simple way to intervene in consciousness itself. No matter how advanced neuroscience becomes, human experience remains incredibly layered. Two people with identical diagnoses can respond completely different to the same treatment. Trauma histories matter, relationships matter, biology matters, environment matters, meaning matters. And maybe the complexity is exactly what early psychosurgery failed to fully respect. The procedures treated emotional suffering as though it could be mechanically corrected through physical alteration alone. Alteration. But emotional life is rarely that straightforward. Consciousness emerges from an unbelievably delicate interaction between memory, biology, emotion, perception, experience, relationships, culture, trauma, and identity. And once medicine intervenes in those systems, unexpected consequences can ripple outward in ways that no one initially predicts. That's one reason modern psychiatric ethics place such enormous importance on informed consent and patient autonomy now. Because history revealed what can happen when institutions begin making life-altering neurological decisions for people without fully understanding long-term outcomes. The collapse of lobotomy as accepted treatment became one of the defining moments that pushed medicine toward stronger ethical safeguards. That's part of the uncomfortable reality of human progress. Advancement is not always so clean-cut. Sometimes entire generations suffer through flawed systems before humanity recognizes the damage clearly enough to change course. Believe it or not, that truth applies far beyond psychiatry. Medical ethics themselves often evolve reactively. Not because humanity enjoys suffering, but because people frequently understand boundaries most clearly after witnessing what happens when those boundaries fail. That doesn't justify the harm, but it does explain why remembering these histories matters. Not to encourage paranoia, not to reject medicine, but to preserve humility. Because humility can be one of the most important protections medicine possesses when dealing with the human mind. Especially now, when neuroscience continues advancing rapidly. Brain mapping, artificial intelligence, neural interfaces, memory studies, cognitive enhancement research. Humanity is once again approaching new territory involved with consciousness itself. And maybe that's why the history of lobotomy still feels relevant. It reminds people that technological capability and ethical wisdom do not automatically evolve at the same speed. That tension never fully disappears. The desire to reduce suffering will always exist. The desire to improve human functioning will also always exist. And the temptation to optimize emotional life will always exist. But history leaves behind an important warning for us. The mind is not simply a problem to solve. The self is not simply a machine to recalibrate. Think about that. The mind is not simply a problem to solve. And the self is not simply a machine to recalibrate. And whenever medicine approaches consciousness without sufficient humility, human beings risk becoming simplified in ways that science may not fully understand until it's far too late. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. Even after everything humanity has learned about the brain, consciousness still remains mysterious. Modern neuroscience can map regions of the brain with incredible precision. Researchers can observe neural activity, track memory formation, study emotional processing, analyze cognition, measure electrical signals. And yet, despite all of that progress, nobody fully understands why consciousness feels the way it does from the inside. Nobody fully understands why subjective experience exists at all, why memories feel personal, why identity feels continuous, why emotion carries meaning, why awareness itself emerges from biology. The closer science moves toward the mind, the more mystery seems to appear around it. And maybe that realization should inspire humility more than certainty. Because throughout this entire series, the real danger was never science. The danger was overconfidence in areas humanity only partially understood. Remember? That's what made lobotomy so haunting historically. It's not merely a procedure. It's the assumption that the human self could be surgically optimized before medicine truly understood what the self even was. And honestly, modern neuroscience has become far more careful, partly because researchers now recognize just how delicate consciousness appears to be. Small neurological changes can create enormous emotional consequences. A tiny injury can alter personality. A chemical imbalance can reshape perception. Trauma can rewire emotional responses. Memory disorders can transform identity. The brain is not a machine with cleanly separated compartments. Everything overlaps. Emotion overlaps with memory. Memory overlaps with identity. Identity overlaps with relationships. Relationships overlap with meaning. And meaning itself may be one of the most mysterious forces shaping human psychological survival. That's part of why reducing suffering is so much more complicated than simply removing unpleasant feelings. People are not designed merely for comfort. People are constantly searching for connection, purpose, belonging, creativity, meaning, understanding. And many of those experiences emerge from emotionally complex things. Grief reflects attachment. Fear reflects vulnerability. Joy reflects connection. Even uncertainty plays a role in reshaping and shaping identity. That doesn't mean that suffering should be glorified. Psychological pain can become unbearable. Mental illness can destroy lives. Compassionate treatment matters enormously. But the history of lobotomy revealed something medicine now approaches with much greater caution. You cannot always remove emotional suffering without affecting other parts of personhood alongside it, because emotion itself is woven deeply into consciousness. That realization leaves humanity standing in a strange position now. More knowledgeable than ever before, but still humbled by an immense amount of unanswered questions. And maybe that humility is actually healthy, because consciousness may not be something humanity should approach with excessive certainty, especially as technology continues advancing so rapidly. Artificial intelligence, neural implants, brain-computer interfaces, memory research, cognitive enhancement technologies. Humanity is once again approaching territory capable of reshaping how people think, fear, remember, and interact with reality itself. And that possibility is exhilarating, isn't it? But it's also kind of sobering, because history already demonstrated what can happen when innovation moves faster than ethical reflection. That's why remembering uncomfortable medical history matters. It's not to reject progress, but to protect wisdom, to preserve caution, to remind future generations that the human mind cannot simply become another industrial system optimized for efficiency. That may be one of the greatest lessons buried inside the collapse of lobotomy. Human beings are not problems to solve mechanically. People are not equations, not productivity systems, not emotional algorithms. Consciousness contains too much complexity for that kind of reduction. And maybe that's ultimately what made the lobotomy era feel so emotionally wrong in retrospect. It treated unpredictability like malfunction. It treated emotional intensity like defect. It treated complicated minds like systems requiring correction. But difficult emotions are often part of what make people fully alive. Love creates vulnerability. Creativity often emerges from emotional depth. Empathy emerges from pain. Growth emerges from struggle. Even uncertainty itself shapes meaning. To remove all emotional difficulty completely might also mean removing parts of the human experience people value most profoundly. And perhaps that's the strange paradox sitting at the center of consciousness itself. The same emotional complexity capable of causing suffering is also capable of creating beauty. That tension may never disappear entirely. And maybe it shouldn't. Because despite all scientific advancement, the human mind still resists becoming fully explainable. And honestly, there's something comforting about that. Not because mystery is always pleasant, but because mystery encourages restraint, humility, carefulness, wonder. The closer humanity moved toward altering the brain directly, the more clearly people eventually realized they were standing in front of something far more fragile and far more profound than anyone initially understood. And maybe that's the final lesson this entire week leaves behind. The mind is not merely biology. It's not merely chemistry. It's not merely circuitry. It's a place where memory, emotion, fear, identity, love, grief, meaning, and consciousness all converge into the experience people call being alive. And that may be something humanity should approach not with fear, but with extraordinary care.